While there are no truly bad cabins on a cruise, I have to admit, I have stayed in some of the most controversial cruise cabins on a ship, and there are some I definitely regret. Hi there, I'm Ilana from the website lifewellcruise.com. Welcome back to my channel. Now, I'm often asked about what are the best and the worst cabins on a cruise. And while this can be subjective, there are some cabins that I booked that I definitely wouldn't book again. Now, my hope with this video is to share these controversial cruise cabins, our experience, and you can see if they are right for you. Now, before I get started, I did want to mention that if you like this video, if you find it helpful, informative, or enjoyable in any way, then please do give this video a big thumbs up. I really do appreciate it, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let's get started. Now, these are genuine, so I am going to warn you, I am going to share some personal stories in this video. So number one, an obstructed balcony cabin. So we had an obstructed balcony cabin on Regal Princess a few years ago. I absolutely love that ship, and it was a great cruise, so it definitely didn't detract from the cruise, but we booked an obstructed balcony cabin, not knowing how bad can that be. Well, I will tell you, I did not have a view when we were sitting down. Our entire view was orange. Now, still, this is better than having an interior cabin in terms of getting outside and having air and having that extra space. So I'm definitely not complaining. But there was one day that I actually walked out onto the balcony. I was standing there, and then out of the lifeboat popped a head, and the crew member working there said, "Hi." Now, we actually laughed about this, and I asked the crew member if I could take a picture. He did allow me, and I thought this was pretty funny. But sometimes when people say that your obstructed cabin won't be that obstructed, I didn't find that to be the case. Number two, an infinite veranda cabin. Now, I actually find this to be one of the most controversial cabins because people either love it or hate it. And I actually had two experiences where I had the exact opposite thought. So one time we were on Celebrity Beyond, I had an infinite veranda cabin and I loved it. And yet on Celebrity Ascent, I really didn't like it at all. And finally, I understood why people don't like it. Now, for me, this had to do with the cabin configuration. When the cabin was configured so that the bed was actually placed near the window or near the veranda area, I just didn't find the cabin seemed as spacious as when it was configured the other way around. Now, there are definitely some benefits to this cabin. In particular, I think if you are maybe on an itinerary like Alaska or something where the likelihood of you actually opening up that veranda window will be lower. But in the Caribbean, it definitely can get really hot in the cabin. We found this on Celebrity Ascent. It got really humid, so sometimes we needed to close up that window. And I have to admit, there were times that I wished I could just step out onto my balcony rather than feeling like I was kind of stuck in my cabin. Now, if you've ever had the infinite veranda cabin, either on Celebrity or on Royal Caribbean's newest ship, please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Number three, an inside cabin. Now, it actually isn't an inside cabin in general because I've had many inside cabins knowing that this was the best value that I could get, and I don't regret that at all. I've had at least 15 inside cabins, and I don't think in themselves they are bad, but we had an inside cabin a few years ago on, it was actually Crown Princess, but we were right underneath the buffet. And typically I always say try to get a cabin that is sandwiched between two public decks, and we had a reason for this. What happened was there were a couple of nights where the ship was moving a lot. It was a little bit of a rocky cruise. There was a lot of wind. In any case, we would hear throughout the entire night what sounded like a cart rolling back and forth, back and forth. Anyway, finally, after the second night, it seemed like that was secured. We never heard it again. But definitely, there can be sounds coming from above or even below. Number four, neighborhood balconies. Now, on the Oasis class in particular, and on Icon as well, on Royal Caribbean, you're going to have those neighborhood balconies. Now, we had a cabin when we first went on Oasis of the Seas in the boardwalk area, and something that we did intentionally was we chose a cabin at the very aft. Typically, I like aft cabins, but something that I didn't think about was, well, firstly, we had that balcony cabin, And even though it was a balcony, we were on the boardwalk. So you didn't get that peaceful feeling that you get from going out onto your balcony and seeing the ocean. That's understandable, right? But we didn't really think about how much we would miss that. And the second thing was the fact that this is such a big ship. Whenever I had to go back to my cabin, I forgot my sunglasses maybe, or we just wanted to pick something up. It literally was a 15-minute walk going back to my cabin and then a 15-minute walk going back to like the midship of the cruise ship. It was such a big cruise ship. And that is something I think for those style of ships in particular, I would choose a cabin that is close by to a stairway or elevator. Now, as I mentioned, even though these were my worst cabins on a cruise, all of these experiences were still good. So if you have a cabin and you're worried about, is my cabin in the right location? Did I make a mistake? Something to think about is the fact that overall, these are still going to be very good experiences. It just is a matter of being able to choose what you like best for you. An ocean view cabin on Freedom of the Seas. Now, we really had a good time on Freedom of the Seas, but that cabin was actually probably one of our worst cabins. So not because it was necessarily ocean view. It was on deck 2, and I know a lot of people wonder, will I like being on lower decks? I haven't found that to be a problem. I've been on lower decks for other ocean view cabins before, as well as occasionally an inside cabin, and I haven't found that to be a problem at all. Now, this cabin was a little bit dated, which I talked about in a past video. That wasn't itself the problem, but I do think for an ocean view cabin, again, it's the cabin configuration. I have had an ocean view cabin before. It was actually on Celebrity Summit, and I really enjoyed it. It didn't bother me to be close to the water. In fact, I actually kind of liked that view. But we had our sofa or our sitting area right near the window, which we really liked. Whereas on Freedom of the Seas, our bed was right under the window. So while we did have the light that came in, it just wasn't optimal for sitting and viewing. Now, I'm going to share some tips towards the end of the video on how you can try to figure out the cabin configuration. And as well, I did want to talk about one thing that has to do with obstructed cabins that I have seen people commenting on that I think people do need to be aware of. A connecting cabin. Now, I have to say, one time we booked a guarantee cabin on a cruise ship, and we didn't know our cabin until we actually arrived, I think on boarding day or maybe a couple of days before. So I didn't really look to see if this was a connecting cabin. When we got into our cabin on embarkation day, we saw the door and we said, oh no. Now, it doesn't mean in itself that a connecting cabin is bad, but you have the potential, depending on who is next door to you, to hear some of the sounds from their cabin. This was a family-oriented cruise ship, so I just didn't know how that would go. Now, luckily, I went over to guest services right away and I asked if there are any other cabins, even the same category, that they could perhaps switch me to. Now, I was very lucky. They were able to switch my cabin to a non-connecting cabin. Now, if they weren't able to, I understood. I booked a guarantee cabin, so I get what I get. But thankfully, they were able to do so, and I avoided what potentially could have been a noisy neighbor. A balcony cabin under the Lido deck. Now, we actually ended up lucking out by getting an aft balcony cabin on Celebrity Summit a few years ago. We were upgraded to that. It was a fabulous cabin. I wouldn't trade it for anything, but we were right underneath. Actually, it was a sunset bar, so not underneath the Lido deck in particular. But what happens, so it's just something to be aware of if you are underneath the Lido deck or any top deck where they put out chairs. At about 6 a.m., maybe even a little bit earlier, we could hear the chairs being put out by the crew. So there was a little bit of scraping and pulling and banging. And even during the day, we could hear a little bit of the sounds. Now, like I said, I would not trade that cabin for anything. But if you are sensitive to noise, make sure that you don't book a cabin right under any top deck. A forward cabin. Now, there seems to be a bit of a theme here because sometimes I book guarantee cabins and you never know what you're going to get. But one time we were actually on a Royal Caribbean ship. It was many years ago, probably on Voyager of the Seas or something like that. And we had a cabin that was further forward. And I always thought, I don't get seasick. I don't feel anything on a ship. But on this ship, it was a little bit rocky during the day. I think we were leaving from New York and we were kind of heading up. So the seas can be a little bit rough. And I went back to my cabin at one point, and in my cabin, I could feel so much movement. Now, luckily, I just left my cabin. Instead, I went over to the pool deck that is like in the center of the ship, and I didn't feel anything. And at nighttime, I never really felt anything at all. But I can attest to the fact that if your cabin is a little bit further forward, you can feel a little bit more movement. So do make sure that you bring seasickness remedies just in case. Obstructed cabins and obstructed balconies. Now, something that you'll want to watch for when it comes to cabins, like I mentioned earlier in this video, is obstructed balcony cabins or even obstructed ocean view cabins, because you probably don't want to have a big lifeboat right in front of your view. However, there is something that you can do. You can Google your cabin number and you can see what the obstruction is, because sometimes it's not a very big obstruction. Sometimes it's just a wire. Sometimes it's just like a ladder at the side. So it may not be that obstructed and it can still be worth it. But what I did want to talk about is actually people that are complaining about obstructed balconies on cruise ships, like even to the cruise line, when these are not obstructed balconies. So yes, we've actually seen that in the cruise news recently. And I did want to share something, because recently I shared my MSC Seascape balcony view, and we were on Carnival Venezia and we had something similar. And basically this is when the ship itself is made in a way that you could see other cabins, maybe other cabins next to you, like on a hump, or you could see cabins below you or even a deck below you. That is not what is really considered a true obstruction. This is just the way the ship is built. Now, when it comes to the cabin configuration, beyond just simply Googling for images that you can definitely do and watching YouTube videos, something else that you can do is you can look at the schematic of the cruise ship. You can usually find this on the deck plans that are on the cruise line website. And you can see that some cabins are almost built like a puzzle piece, where when you look at two cabins side by side, you can see that one will have an indent towards the front or the left, and the other will have an indent towards the right. Typically that indent area is the bed itself. So if you want to see where the sitting area is, you can simply look for the narrower area, and that is typically going to be where you have your sofa and your desk. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Please let me know, what are some of the worst cabins that you've ever been in and why? Please let me know down in the comments below. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do give it a big thumbs up. I really do appreciate it. And please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Bye for now, and happy cruising.